I first noticed it when Amelia started withdrawing from our usual routines. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, but it became increasingly clear that it was harder for her to meet my gaze at the dinner table or give me a kiss in the morning before we went our separate ways. I used to look forward to the small, intimate gestures in our daily life, but suddenly, it felt like she was actively avoiding them. When I asked her how she was doing, she often gave evasive answers or brushed off my concerns with a vague, "I'm just tired. There's a lot going on at work right now." I tried to take it at face value. People go through stressful periods, and Amelia had previously experienced ups and downs in her mood. But this time, it felt different. I remember how, instead of sitting with me on the couch in the evenings like she usually did, she found excuses to be in another room. She just had to reply to an email or quickly check something on the computer. When this started happening systematically, almost every night for a week, I became more worried. But I tried to convince myself that maybe I was overreacting, that I might have been too busy to see things from the right perspective. I'm someone who values stability and loyalty above all else, and I always want to believe the best about the people I love. So, I didn't press Amelia for details at that point. I sensed that something was wrong, but I didn't want to label it just yet. Maybe it was a form of burnout or boredom with daily life that she was hesitant to talk about. Maybe she just needed some breathing room. At the same time, it was hard not to notice how stressed she became when her phone rang. She used to always leave her phone in the kitchen or hallway and barely care who was calling. But now, she was visibly nervous every time a call came in. Sometimes she quickly went into another room and lowered her voice. When I asked, "Who was that?" I often got a half-hearted answer like, "Just work," or "Nothing important." She then withdrew, ended the call quickly, and went back to whatever she was doing. Each time it happened, it pricked at my chest. I had no concise explanation for why I felt that way, but for the first time in our marriage, I felt that Amelia was hiding something. She also started finding new excuses to go out on late errands. Sometimes she would buy something small at the store, but it took an unreasonably long time. Other times, she would meet a friend at the last minute, and when I suggested I could drive her or that we could go together, she declined with a vague explanation that it was a sensitive conversation. To avoid seeming controlling, I stayed in the background. I tried to be understanding and didn't want to show my insecurity, but she became increasingly skilled at finding reasons to be away. It wasn't just physically that she withdrew, it was emotionally too. The conversations we used to have about the future, about work, about our friends, those became brief or non-existent. Soon, I noticed that our shared morning routines began to fall apart. Amelia used to love having a coffee together before we both left for work, but now she might sit for 2 minutes at the table before gulping down her coffee and disappearing. I tried to compensate by asking simple questions about how she slept or what her plans were for the day. Her answers, when they came, were often short and dismissive. I remember how she looked down into her cup, avoiding eye contact. The uncomfortable silence spoke more than words ever could. I began sleeping restlessly. I'm not someone who usually dwells on things at night, but my thoughts wouldn't stop spinning. Had I done something wrong? Was there something I said or did that made Amelia so distant? I tried to analyze everything in my head and got nowhere. Not once did it cross my mind that she might be unfaithful. Our relationship had always been built on an unspoken sense of security, a kind of agreement that we belonged together and wouldn't betray each other. Even when we fought, which happened occasionally like in any marriage, there was a foundation of loyalty that I thought was unshakable. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. At the same time, strangely enough, there were moments when Amelia seemed completely normal, almost overly eager to act like everything was fine. She would suddenly give me a warm hug in the kitchen and say, "I love you, you know that, right?" But seconds later, she would look away as if she regretted letting her emotions show. As the weeks went by, I reached a point where I could no longer dismiss it as a temporary slump. One evening, I decided to try to have a more serious conversation with her. "Amelia, are you okay? I've noticed that you've been withdrawing. We hardly do anything together anymore, and I can't help but feel worried," I said calmly and gently as we sat at the kitchen table. She shrugged and looked down. "I don't know. I'm probably just stressed. I don't know how to say it, but I need some time for myself." I tried to respect that. I'm not someone who wants to corner people, especially not my own wife. I told her I understood and that she could talk to me more when she felt ready. The next day, everything continued as usual, but the atmosphere remained tense. She barely answered when I asked how she had slept, and when she came home later that evening, she looked pale and nervous. I decided not to push her further and convinced myself that a little time might solve the problem, but that maybe hung over me like a shadow. That night, I stayed awake for a long time. I think it was then that the first vague suspicion crept into my mind. I thought about how stressed she became over her phone, how she suddenly seemed to have errands everywhere, and how she didn't want to give any clear explanations. There was a voice inside me that whispered, "She's with someone else," but I immediately dismissed it. Amelia and I had been married for years. We had weathered tough times before, including financial setbacks and illness in her family. It wasn't possible that she would just throw it all away for someone else, I thought. At the same time, I couldn't turn off the feeling of fear. I went into the living room, sat down on the couch, and tried to gather my thoughts. What do you do in such a situation? You don't want to be paranoid, but you also don't want to be naive. A few days later, Amelia came home even later than usual. She had called to say she needed to stay late at work, but she was vague about why. When she finally walked through the front door, it was past 10 at night, and she looked almost guilty as she met my gaze. I tried to appear normal, but I noticed that she avoided eye contact when she said, "Sorry I'm late. There was a lot of overtime, and then I got stuck in traffic." I just nodded and asked her to sit down to eat the now cold food on the table. "I already ate," she said. That didn't match what she had said earlier about being starving and hoping I had something good ready. But I let it slide and sat silently beside her in the kitchen as she took off her jacket and put down her things. I noticed she took out her phone and put it in her pocket before I could see the screen. At that moment, I felt it clearly. She's hiding something. That night, I decided to dig deeper. I had finally convinced myself that it was better to know the truth, no matter how unpleasant, than to live in constant uncertainty. Amelia fell asleep quickly, perhaps because she was mentally exhausted from all the secrecy, and I stayed awake in bed. The thoughts churned in my mind. What if she actually is cheating? What would I do then? I tried to imagine what my life would look like without her. It felt impossible. The thought that we might not share a future anymore filled me with a cold, creeping panic, but also with a strange anger. I felt foolish for even considering the possibility that she might not be faithful. But I decided that I needed more information. A few days later, the moment arrived when I could uncover the truth. Amelia was late coming home again. She had left her laptop in the living room to charge. It was still on, and I knew her messenger was connected to it, and I immediately felt uncomfortable. Was it really right for me to delve into her private conversations? But at the same time, she had never made a big deal about us looking through each other's phones or computers when necessary. I didn't want to be a jealous husband spying on his wife, but now I saw no other way. I needed to know. Otherwise, I would be tormented by uncertainty. So, I opened her messenger. At first, I only found superficial conversations with friends and colleagues, but then a conversation with a man I didn't recognize appeared. I remember he had a fairly common name, nothing that stood out. I clicked on the thread and suddenly my world was turned upside down. The first message I saw was a photo of him and Amelia together at a hotel bar. The timestamp was from last week, an evening she had claimed to be working late. Alongside it were conversations that undeniably indicated they had a physical relationship. I scrolled upward and read messages about planned meetings in a hotel room, cryptic references to sexual innuendos. "I think about you all the time, and when can we meet again?" Typical things one would write to a new infatuation or a lover. The photos from the hotel room were too explicit for there to be any other explanation than infidelity. I felt my breath leave me. It was like someone had punched me in the stomach. Was this really happening? When Amelia came home that evening, I was sitting on the couch, paralyzed by what I had just discovered. I didn't confront her directly. I was too much in shock. I just stared at her as she walked through the door and said, "Hi, honey." The sound of her voice almost made me feel sick. I replied curtly, and she disappeared into the bedroom to change. I remained on the couch, staring blankly ahead, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions. The shock, the grief, the anger, the shame that I might have been a bad husband. All of it mixed into a chaotic mess. Even though I felt like screaming at her that she was a liar and a cheater, I found myself immobilized. Maybe I needed more time to absorb it all. When I finally went into the bedroom to sleep, I barely spoke to her. She was already in bed, turned away from me, just as she had been so many other nights lately. It felt like a physical manifestation of the chasm that had grown between us. The next day, while I was at work, a wave of anger washed over me. I had to lock myself in the bathroom to avoid losing my composure in front of my colleagues. I thought, how could she do this to me? How long has this been going on? Why didn't I notice anything earlier? I swore to myself that I would never let anyone treat me like this again. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with the information I had. Should I confront her directly? Should I talk to friends or family for advice? Or should I contact a lawyer? It felt like my brain was both overloaded and frozen. But then it hit me. I needed legal advice. If our relationship was over, I at least wanted to know how to end it in a sensible and fair way. I searched for a family lawyer online that same day and booked an appointment. Even though I didn't know if I definitely wanted a divorce, I felt I needed to understand my options. Contacting a lawyer felt surreal. I had always imagined that Amelia and I would be together for life. We had even talked about possibly having kids someday, or at least shared dreams about the future, traveling more, maybe buying a bigger house when finances allowed. Now, I was sitting in a stark office in the city center, explaining to a stranger that my wife was unfaithful and that I was considering divorce. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with a calm voice, explained matter-of-factly that I should gather evidence and then decide whether I really wanted to divorce. He also said I should look into finding an apartment in case I needed to move out. "It's always good to have a plan B," he said with professional detachment. I nodded, still in a fog of shock. How had my life turned upside down so quickly? When I got home that evening, Amelia wasn't there. She had sent an email saying she would be working late again. I laughed bitterly to myself. These days, working late was a synonym for being with him. It burned in my chest to think about them together. My anger escalated, but at least I managed to channel the energy into starting to look for an apartment. I scrolled through housing ads, feeling a cold lump grow in my stomach. It was as if I had already accepted that the marriage was doomed, even though I hadn't yet told Amelia what I knew. Inside, a battle was raging. Part of me wanted to pack my bags and disappear without a trace, while another part wanted to scream and force her to explain herself. I kept scrolling until I found a few potential places within a reasonable distance of my work. I marked them as favorites, but then shut off the computer. It was too heavy to think about. I wasn't ready to leave everything behind, not yet. But the thoughts churned. She's already left you, Jason, at least emotionally. That voice in my head was raw and honest. I couldn't help but agree. Even when Amelia was home, she was distant and cold. The exception was the times she could suddenly be overly warm, perhaps out of guilt. Those irregular moments of forced affection almost made me feel worse because I knew they were a facade. Still, I remained silent. Perhaps it was cowardly, but I needed more time. I needed to understand how I felt before I dropped the bombshell on her. A week went by, and during that time I found even more evidence of her betrayal. I found receipts for hotel stays she had paid for with a credit card we rarely used. I saw her bank statements and noted transfers and unfamiliar restaurant visits. What the hell happened to men paying for everything? Everything pointed to her regularly meeting this man. It made me nauseous to see how much time and energy she devoted to him. I couldn't understand how she could break all our promises. I might sound naive, but I thought our wedding vows meant something. I took them very seriously and found it hard to grasp how she could throw them away without even discussing it with me. Eventually, I decided I was ready to confront her. I had enough evidence. I had also already spoken to the lawyer about how a divorce would proceed practically. I had called him earlier that day and said I might need his services soon, and he assured me he was ready. Now was the time. Amelia was home that evening, which had become quite rare. She was sitting in the living room, flipping through a magazine, but mostly looking distracted. I told her we needed to talk. She looked up, immediately uncomfortable. Her body language revealed that she probably understood what was coming. I sat down across from her and laid everything out. Receipts for hotel stays, copies of her messages with the other man, the photos I had found. I presented the evidence one by one without saying anything. letting the items speak for themselves. Her expression shifted between panic, fear, and shame. When she began to speak, her voice was trembling. Jason, it's not what it looks like. I became utterly furious at those words. Not what it looks like? I've read your messages. I've seen your receipts. What more do I need to know? She defended herself by saying she felt lonely, that I worked too much, that I didn't give her enough attention. I was shocked that she tried to shift the blame onto me. Sure, I worked a lot, but it was for our shared future to ensure we had financial stability. I always believed that if there was a problem, she would talk to me about it, not go behind my back. The discussion grew intense. I felt my pulse pounding in my temples as I said, what you should have done is told me you were feeling bad, that you felt neglected, that we needed to find a solution. That's what people do in a healthy marriage. Amelia continued staring at the floor. She replied that she had made a mistake, that she was lost, that everything had gone too far, and that she didn't know how to get out of it. I sat there, trembling with anger. Now I was facing a person who had openly admitted to betraying me, and she didn't even seem to grasp the gravity of her actions. I told her I didn't know if I could forgive her for this, that I was considering divorce. That's when she broke down. She started crying hysterically, throwing herself to her knees in front of me, begging and pleading for another chance, not to leave her and not to throw away everything we had built. I pointed out that I hadn't thrown anything away. She was the one who did that, with a man who apparently wasn't worth anything at all, since she was ready to dump him on the spot. I thought I was prepared to hear her beg, but I wasn't. Her tears affected me more than I wanted to admit. Even though I was furious and felt betrayed, I remembered our shared memories, our promises to each other, everything we had gone through. I had taken our marriage vows very seriously and felt torn between keeping them or acknowledging that she had broken them and there was nothing left to save. I didn't say much more that evening. I mostly wandered around the house like a restless ghost, trying to gather my thoughts while Amelia lay in bed crying. Eventually, I lay down on the couch in the living room, staring up at the ceiling. I didn't sleep a wink. The next day, a sense grew within me that I needed to get away to figure out what I really wanted. I told Amelia I would move out for a few days just to think. She protested vehemently, trying to hold me back, but I couldn't think clearly with her constantly present. We had a heated argument by the front door where she literally stood in my way, begging me to stay. But I felt I needed distance. So I packed a few bags and called my friend Marcus, who fortunately had a guest room available for a few days. Over the following days, Amelia bombarded me with texts and phone calls. At first, I replied briefly, mostly saying, I don't know yet, I need more time. But eventually, I turned off my phone because I couldn't handle her constant tears, promises, and pleas. I tried to juggle my emotions, one moment thinking, maybe we can fix this with therapy, maybe it's not too late, and the next moment recalling the images from her messages and feeling like I never wanted to see her again. After a few days, I felt ready to go home. I didn't entirely know what I would say, but I thought I could at least give her an ultimatum or discuss under what conditions we might possibly move forward. I had also booked an appointment with a relationship counselor for the following week, in case I decided to try to save the relationship. But when I opened the front door and stepped into our house, I sensed something was off. It was completely silent. I called out, Amelia, but got no response. I went into the bedroom and found her and her lover in our bed. He was pounding her hard, and then I heard him say, better than Jason, right? To which she replied, oh God, yes! I stood frozen in the doorway. It was no longer possible to deny what was happening. They jumped out of bed, both shocked to see me home so early. I could see the shame in her eyes as she covered herself with the sheet, desperately trying to find words. But I didn't need to hear anything more. There was nothing left to say. Everything had been said. At that moment, something became crystal clear to me. Amelia was no longer the person I had married. She had no boundaries left, no respect for our shared history. I didn't say a word. I turned around, walked out of the room, and headed down the stairs. As I approached the front door, I heard her shout, Jason, let me explain! But I didn't want to hear anything more. I no longer felt any desire to be fair or reasonable. I was done. After this complete humiliation, there was nothing left to save. I drove away aimlessly for a while, feeling a strange mixture of relief and devastating sorrow. Later that evening, when I had calmed down somewhat, I called my lawyer and said I was ready. We scheduled an appointment for the next morning. I briefly explained what had happened. He let me speak without interruption. Then he said he would send out the divorce filing. I felt a sense of relief, as horrible as that sounds. For the first time in a very long time, I had a clear goal: to get away from a person who clearly didn't care about me or our promises. Amelia kept calling and sending messages for several days, begging me to give her another chance. She wrote that it was a temporary mistake, that she was confused, that she loved me, and that she couldn't live without me. I have never seen anyone cry as much as she did when she tried to stop me from moving forward with the divorce. But for me, enough was enough. I started arranging the division of property and finances, contacted the bank, transferred money to my own account, and ensured that all shared direct debits were canceled. I did what I had to do to protect myself. It didn't take long before it became clear that her lover wasn't interested in being with her for real, especially not when talk of divorce arose and things could get messy. Amelia called me at one point under the pretext of discussing practical matters, but in reality she wanted to tell me how he had pulled away and wasn't answering her calls. "He's afraid of complications," she said. I felt no sympathy. She had made her choice, and now she had to face the consequences. I couldn't muster any compassion for her losing her affair. It was almost ironic how quickly everything collapsed for her once I put my foot down. In the following weeks, I packed up my things and moved into the apartment I had found. It wasn't big or luxurious, but it gave me a fresh start, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts and feelings. Amelia occasionally tried to show up and talk things out, but I didn't let her in. Legally, everything was in motion, and I didn't want to expose myself to more emotional chaos. Friends who had previously seen Amelia as the lively, social woman began to understand what had happened. Rumors spread that she had an affair and was now left alone. Her finances weren't stable either, as we had relied heavily on my income, and she didn't seem to have a realistic plan for how to manage. It didn't take long before others became aware of her deceitful behavior, which further isolated her. At one point, I went to the house to pick up the last of my things and saw her sitting on the couch, red-eyed and defeated. "Can't we just try one last time?" she said in a voice that no longer sounded like hers. I shook my head. I think she truly understood then that I wasn't going to change my mind. I'm sure she felt terrible at that moment, but I couldn't save her anymore. I actually felt a small pang of sadness for her. Not because I wanted her back, but because I realized she had wasted something incredibly valuable and replaced it with nothing. Being a plaything for that man was apparently more important than our life and the comfortable existence we had built. When the divorce was finally finalized, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Sure, there was still pain and scars left in me, but I was no longer trapped in a relationship built on betrayal. It felt like I could breathe again, look forward, and start thinking about myself and my own happiness. I had lost a few years of my life to a person who didn't see the value in being faithful and honest, but there was no reason to cling to her. Amelia, on the other hand, was now left without a marriage or a lover. She had also burned bridges with some mutual friends who couldn't accept her betrayal of me. I heard rumors about how she struggled to pay her bills and how she was no longer as welcome among several of our former friends. I realized she was now also facing the consequences of her actions, and it wasn't my responsibility to save her. I think she hoped that once everything had settled, I would miss her so much that I might reach out to her again, but I had had enough. I deserved better than to play second fiddle in a marriage where the promises were forgotten. I moved on, focused on myself, my work, and my new life. Slowly but surely, I started sleeping better and finding joy in small things. I visited friends, traveled a bit, and took up old hobbies I had set aside. Eventually, I met other people, built new relationships and friendships. In the end, she had destroyed our relationship through her betrayal, and I had to accept that love couldn't survive such disloyalty. It didn't matter that she cried and apologized because her actions and words had proven that she wasn't willing to change. I had given her a chance to explain herself when I confronted her with the evidence, but she chose to lie further and continue her affair. And when I finally came home after a few days' break, she chose to have him in our bed. It was almost like a slap in the face, proof that she didn't respect me at all. That was where it all ended for me. After that, there was no turning back.
If you liked this story, please subscribe and give us a thumbs up. It helps a lot, and you won't miss out on any future stories. Take care and live your best life.